The village of Uma lay shrouded in a thick veil of mist, its thatched roofs and mud huts blending seamlessly into the rolling hills of rural Ghana. The air was heavy with the scent of yams and cassava, and the sound of drums echoed through the valleys, a rhythmic heartbeat that seemed to pulse with the very life of the village. In a small hut on the outskirts of the village, a young woman named Adwoa lay on a mat, her body trembling with the pains of childbirth. Her husband, Kofi, sat beside her, holding her hand and whispering words of encouragement. The village's elderly midwife, Mama Aku, attended to Adwoa, her hands moving with a gentle precision that belied her age. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the village, Adwoa's cries grew louder, and Mama Aku's hands moved with increasing urgency. Finally, with one final push, a small, fragile form emerged into the world. Mama Aku held the baby up, and Adwoa's eyes lit up with joy. But as Mama Aku began to clean the baby, she noticed something strange. The baby's skin seemed to be covered in a fine, downy hair, and her eyes seemed to gleam with an otherworldly intensity. Mama Aku's hands moved with a growing sense of unease as she realized that this was no ordinary child. "What's wrong, Mama Aku?" Adwoa asked, her voice trembling with concern. Mama Aku's face was a mask of calm, but her eyes betrayed a deep unease. "Nothing, child," she said. "Just a little unusual." As the night wore on, the villagers began to gather outside Adwoa's hut, curious about the new arrival. They whispered among themselves, their voices hushed and speculative. "I've never seen a baby like that before," one of the villagers said. "Maybe it's a sign," another villager suggested. "A sign of good fortune, or perhaps, something else." As the villagers dispersed, Mama Aku remained behind, her eyes fixed on the baby. She knew that something was not quite right, something that went beyond the ordinary explanations of the village. And as she gazed into the baby's eyes, she felt a shiver run down her spine. The baby's eyes seemed to be watching her, seeming to hold a deep and ancient wisdom that was both captivating and terrifying. Mama Aku knew that she had to be careful, that this child was not like other children. And as she looked at the baby, she whispered a single word, Egbera. The night wore on, and the village slept, unaware of the darkness that was to come. But Mama Aku knew, deep in her bones, that something was stirring, something that would change. As the days passed, the villagers began to notice strange occurrences. Tools would go missing, food would spoil, and the once clear streams would run murky. At first, they dismissed it as mere coincidence, but soon, the events became too frequent to ignore. People began to whisper about the baby, Egbera, and the misfortunes that seemed to follow her. Kofi, Egbera's father, tried to reassure the villagers that the strange events were just a result of bad luck. However, as the events continued, even he couldn't shake off the feeling that something was amiss. He would catch glimpses of Egbera staring at him with an unnerving intensity, and he would feel a shiver run down his spine. One day, a villager named Akua touched Egbera's hand while passing by Adwoa's hut. Within days, Akua fell ill with a mysterious disease that left her skin covered in painful sores. The villagers were convinced that Egbera was cursed, and that anyone who touched her would be afflicted with bad luck or even death. Fear and superstition began to grip the village. People avoided Adwoa's hut, and the family was forced to fend for themselves. Kofi would venture out to hunt and gather food, but the villagers would not speak to him or look him in the eye. As the villagers' fear grew, so did their hostility towards Egbera and her family. They began to accuse Adwoa of being a witch, and Kofi of being foolish for believing her claims that Egbera was just a normal child. The villagers' accusations became more and more aggressive, and Adwoa and Kofi found themselves increasingly isolated. One night, the villagers gathered outside Adwoa's hut, demanding that she hand over Egbera. They claimed that the baby was a curse on the village, and that they would take matters into their own hands if Adwoa didn't comply. Adwoa and Kofi were terrified, and they knew that they had to protect their child. In desperation, Adwoa turned to Mama Aku, the elderly midwife who had delivered Egbera. Mama Aku had always been a source of wisdom and guidance in the village, and Adwoa hoped that she might know what to do. But when Mama Aku arrived, she brought news that only added to the family's fears. Egbera must be taken to the evil forest, Mama Aku said, her voice low and serious. The villagers will not calm down until she is gone. Adwoa and Kofi were horrified. The evil forest was a place of dark legend, where the villagers would abandon their unwanted and their dead. But they knew that they had no choice. They had to protect Egbera, even if it meant sacrificing their own well-being. With heavy hearts, Adwoa and Kofi prepared to take Egbera to the evil forest, knowing that it might be the only way to save their village from the curse that seemed to be afflicting them. But as they set out on their journey, they couldn't shake off the feeling that they were abandoning their child to a fate worse than death. The village of Uma descended into darkness and fear as the days passed. The villagers' superstition and paranoia grew, and they became convinced that Egbera was the source of all their troubles. They would whisper to each other in hushed tones, their eyes darting nervously towards Adwoa's hut, as if expecting some malevolent force to emerge at any moment. The villagers' behavior became more and more erratic. They would lash out at each other, and at Adwoa and Kofi, who were increasingly isolated and ostracized. The once thriving village was now on the brink of collapse, as fear and suspicion tore it apart. One night, a group of villagers gathered outside Adwoa's hut, demanding that she hand over Egbera. They were armed with torches and sticks, and their faces were twisted with anger and fear. Adwoa and Kofi knew that they had to protect their child, and they barricaded themselves inside the hut. The villagers tried to break down the door, but Adwoa and Kofi held firm. Just when it seemed like the situation couldn't get any worse, Mama Aku appeared, her eyes blazing with a fierce determination. "Stop this," she shouted, her voice carrying above the din of the villagers. "You are not solving anything with violence." The villagers hesitated, and Mama Aku took advantage of the momentary pause. She pushed her way through the crowd and entered the hut, where she found Adwoa and Kofi trembling with fear. "We must take Egbera to the evil forest," Mama Aku said, her voice firm but gentle. "It's the only way to save the village." Adwoa and Kofi knew that they had no choice. They took Egbera and set out for the evil forest, leaving behind the only home they had ever known. As they walked, the darkness seemed to close in around them, and they couldn't shake off the feeling that they were walking into a nightmare from which they would never awaken. The evil forest loomed before them, its trees twisted and gnarled, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out to snatch the living. Adwoa and Kofi hesitated, their hearts heavy with grief and fear. But they knew that they had to do what they thought was best for Egbera. They took a deep breath, and stepped into the darkness of the forest, leaving behind the village that had once been their home. As they disappeared into the trees, the villagers breathed a collective sigh of relief. They thought that they had solved the problem, that they had rid themselves of the curse that had afflicted them. But deep in the forest, Adwoa and Kofi knew that they had made a terrible mistake. Egbera, the child they loved and feared, was not what they thought she was. And the evil forest held secrets and terrors that would haunt them forever. As Adwoa and Kofi walked deeper into the evil forest, the darkness seemed to close in around them. They could hear the sounds of wild animals, and the rustling of leaves as unknown creatures scurried through the underbrush. Egbera, however, seemed to be at peace, her eyes gleaming with an otherworldly intensity in the fading light. As the night wore on, Adwoa and Kofi grew more and more exhausted. They had been walking for hours, and the forest seemed to be endless. Just when they thought they couldn't go any further, they stumbled upon a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient tree, its branches twisted and gnarled with age. Adwoa and Kofi approached the tree, their hearts heavy with grief and fear. They knew that they had to leave Egbera here, alone and vulnerable, in the hope that the village would be spared from the curse that seemed to afflict them. But as they looked at Egbera, they saw something that made their blood run cold. Egbera's eyes seemed to be glowing with an ethereal light, and her skin seemed to be shimmering with a strange, otherworldly energy. Adwoa and Kofi exchanged a terrified glance, and they knew that they had made a terrible mistake. Suddenly, the air around them seemed to shift and ripple, and a figure emerged from the shadows. It was an old woman, her face lined with age and wisdom. She approached Adwoa and Kofi, her eyes gleaming with a deep understanding. "You don't understand, do you?" she said, her voice low and gentle. "Egbera is not cursed. She is a blessing. She is a child of the gods, sent to bring light and hope to a world that has forgotten its way." Adwoa and Kofi stared at the old woman, their minds reeling with shock and confusion. They had thought that Egbera was a curse, a monster, but it seemed that they had been wrong all along. The old woman smiled, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "You have been blinded by fear and superstition," she said. "But I will show you the truth. Come with me." And with that, the old woman led Adwoa and Kofi on a journey of discovery, a journey that would change their lives forever. They learned about Egbera's true nature, and the purpose for which she had been sent to the world. And as they learned, they realized that they had been given a rare gift, a chance to make things right, and to bring light and hope to a world that desperately needed it. The old woman's words had a profound impact on Adwoa and Kofi. They realized that their fear and superstition had blinded them to the truth, and that Egbera was not a curse, but a blessing. As they journeyed with the old woman, they learned about Egbera's true nature and the purpose for which she had been sent to the world. As they walked, the forest seemed to transform around them. The trees seemed taller and greener, and the flowers seemed more vibrant and colorful. Adwoa and Kofi felt a sense of peace and hope that they had not felt in a long time. When they returned to the village, they were met with a mixture of emotions. Some villagers were hostile and fearful, while others were curious and open-minded. Adwoa and Kofi knew that it would take time for the villagers to understand and accept the truth about Egbera. But they were determined to share their newfound knowledge with the village. They told the villagers about Egbera's true nature, and the purpose for which she had been sent to the world. Slowly but surely, the villagers began to understand and accept the truth. As the days passed, the village began to transform. The villagers began to see Egbera in a new light, and they began to appreciate her unique gifts and abilities. Adwoa and Kofi's relationship with the villagers improved, and they were no longer ostracized and feared. Egbera, too, seemed to thrive in her new environment. She began to smile and laugh, and her eyes sparkled with joy and curiosity. Adwoa and Kofi knew that they had made the right decision in embracing Egbera's true nature, and they were grateful for the old woman's wisdom and guidance. As the village prospered and grew, Adwoa and Kofi knew that they would always be grateful for the lessons they had learned. They had learned that fear and superstition could be destructive, but that love and understanding could bring people together and create a brighter future. And as they looked at Egbera, they knew that they would always cherish and protect her, not because they feared her, but because they loved her. They knew that Egbera was a blessing, a gift from the gods, and they were grateful for her presence in their lives.